Ladies and gentlemen, here with us is an award-winning TV journalist, anchor with more than 2 decades of reporting experience. Joining her will be the host of Explosity's podcast, The Literary City, with Ramjee Chandran, of course. That's the name of this podcast. Writer, magazine publisher for over 3 decades. They will be talking about the new book, To Hell and Back, Humans of COVID. Ladies and gentlemen, Barkha Dutt with Ramjee Chandran. A huge round of applause as we call up Barkha Dutt along with Ramjee Chandran. The stage is all yours.
It's a wonderful thing for me to share a stage with Barkha because I've admired her work for all these years. When the lockdown happened, the media was exempted from the lockdown. Now, Barkha correctly took it to mean that the media is exempt because we have a responsibility to go out and report on what's happening, bringing information to the public. So she did, but not ordinarily. Across the country, with a small team, she traveled 30,000 kilometers by surface on all sorts of surface transports, north to south and back, and then some. She logged stories of the worst off among us. All of us handled the pandemic in different ways. Some of us made sourdough bread. Some of us didn't. Now, the book, her book, which is The Humans of COVID, To Hell and Back, tells stories of people who suffered the pandemic in ways that we can think about, we think we know about it, but a reading of that book actually brings it home. Now, it tells stories of people who cared for the dead, last rites conducted on people from a different faith. They gave the dead a dignity that the state, the community, and the pandemic had taken from them. Now, across the nation, with all the stories of the heroes of COVID, the victims of COVID, and also the underlying callousness, wrong calls, bureaucratic bungling, and all round, it shouldn't fall to anyone but a journalist to be able to bring those stories home and bring it all together and present it in this wonderful book. Now, Barkha's journey with COVID was not just 30,000 miles or kilometers by road. This whole business of COVID turned deeply personal for her when she lost her father to COVID right in the middle of her exercise. That sort of loss and grief is not easy for us to understand. We have a notion as to what it is. But she soldiers on and tells the story of all the people she encountered across the country, with the sort of disciplined prose that is the hallmark of a seasoned journalist. Now, Barkha is so much more than somebody with a book, or she's a part of what changed journalism in India. She's an active part of all that. And in the time that we have, I want to start talking to her about her life, about what we know about her, and if there's time at the end, maybe a couple of questions. So to start off, when this time when opinion is divided across the world and media is characterized by the sort of headless chickenism that exists everywhere, your career is a valuable exercise. So let's get the skinny on much of this as possible. There's a change, there's a point at which journalism changed, and to my mind, that changed with the advent of cable news networks. I believe that things actually changed. You were right there in the heart of it when it happened. Were you cognizant of the fact that you were changing things?
Thank you, Ramjee, and hi, everyone. It's good to see so many of you here. It's an interesting question because I call myself a child of television. What I mean by that is, unlike many other people who came to television from newspapers, I came as a first-generation visual storyteller, broadcast journalist. Many of you are very young here, so I'm just going to randomly ask you, do you have any idea when private news actually started in India? Ballpark? Anybody? Anyone? 1995 is the correct answer, when 2 companies, India Today and NDTV, were asked to produce a 30-minute news bulletin in English and Hindi for Doordarshan, our public broadcaster. But before that news could be put on, it was vetted and cleared and approved by bureaucrats in the Information and Broadcasting Ministry. Today, you're in a situation where you have hundreds of channels, but does anyone even watch them, right? So that's That's how you framed the question, and I would partially agree and partially disagree. As a child of the broadcast medium, someone who did 2 masters in film production and visual storytelling and journalism, I believe the visual medium is magical if used for magic. But if it is used only for talking heads, for extreme voices made to sit night after night, where you already as a viewer know what they're going to say before they say it, then you're actually devaluing the medium. So I would disagree with you to the extent that I don't think it's the medium that's the problem. I think it's what the medium became that's the problem. So for example, you have the biggest story to cover in our lifetime, which is the pandemic. It's a global story. And I am shocked, Ramjee, that as I am walking with migrant workers as they're walking hundreds of kilometers home, the people I see out on the street in terms of media is a handful of language press, regional reporters from newspapers, local newspapers, what in our profession is called stringers, who are, freelance contributors with just a little phone kit, and photographers, and a handful, I could probably count them on one hand, independent storytellers like myself. TV went missing. Now, if the wealthy newsrooms with the satellite vans and the big resources aren't willing to spend money on reporting, aren't willing to reflect the issues that matter to people, it isn't the medium that's the problem, it's what's being done with the medium that's the problem. But in my book, very briefly, there is a mea culpa moment. I identify as a reporter. Many people see me as an anchor, a presenter, an editor. I've been all of these things. Today I'm an entrepreneur.
Right.
I identify as a reporter, and I say in the opening chapter of this book that somewhere along the way, I also got caught up in the staleness of TV. I also became a studio rat. And that's why I'm so glad I left television. And people said, is this Barkha 2.0? And I said, no, it's Barkha 1.0. I just forgotten what I'd become a journalist for.
I agree with the 1.0 because when you started out, you were this new class of people called warrior TV reporters, right? And Swaminath Iyer famously wrote a piece where he talked about the journalists from CNN being the new Kshatriyas, for instance, and that whole gamut of that.
Right.
Now, in '97, it was quite the news that people were there using the medium, like you said. And India Today wrote a piece, and it was written by a former colleague of mine, Vijay Thapa. And he wrote a piece where he quoted you at the end. Oh. And there's a rather interesting incident.
Oh, the monkey?
You were trying to get a sound bite from Kalpanath Rai, but that's not the only bite you got.
Yeah. Look, I think there's been a paradigm shift in news. When I joined news, it was not a glamorous profession. It didn't pay a lot of money. I remember when I started getting my first salary and it was 8,000 rupees, I was ecstatic. And I said, oh my God, in my life, I had never thought that I could ever earn 8,000 rupees a month. I mean, it just felt like the most thrilling thing. And the reason I'm actually sharing my first salary with you is to basically say that a bunch of us were there because we were kind of maniacs for the news. We loved it. We were there because I couldn't sleep at night without thinking about tomorrow's story. It's how I ended up at the front line of covering a war. I couldn't sleep if I was not in Kargil. It's how I ended up reporting COVID because I couldn't sleep sitting inside the studio. There was something kind of primal. So this story that Ramjee's referencing, it's kind of a funny story. There used to be a politician called Kalpanath Rai, and he'd been arrested on charges of links with the underworld. And he was sort of this character who couldn't really speak English very well, but would insist on quoting Shakespeare. So he was interesting. And he was being sentenced in a local court. So I arrived along with many other journalists to cover this sentencing, but the police decided to barricade us and put a string. Barricade means they just put like a little rope and put about 70 of us behind that rope. And I had been tasked by the newsroom that you have to get an interview with this man. Your assignment today is to get an interview with this man. And so as he was coming down the ramp from the courtroom, having been sentenced to, 30 years in prison or something, I made a charge. I slipped under the rope and I went charging with my camera, and my cameraman was behind me. And I jumped onto a parapet and I was hanging with one foot in the air, holding a microphone to him. And suddenly he started quoting Shakespeare, and there were tears down my face, and he thought I was crying because, he was so eloquent. But actually, while he was doing this, there was a monkey at my ankle, biting me through this interview. Because the monkey had got scared, poor monkey, at this charge of reporters and cameras and, all the rest of it. And yeah, there were 6 rabies injections later.
Yes, those were the days when you had to have many of those rabies
Yes,
injections.
yes.
So you weren't moved by his piety.
No, certainly not.
It's important for people to understand
No, it was amazing.
what it took
Yeah.
to be the new journalist in India. Because before then it was very staid, wire stories. You reported wire stories in print. You were done for the day. You went to the press club, and that's all there was to it. Your tribe changed something very different, and these anecdotes are very valuable to give a sense of where it is. Tell us about the time you jumped on top of the ambassador car and wouldn't get down.
I'm really being outed here today. Okay, so there was literally a proverbial spy who came home. His name was Ruplal, and he had served in a Pakistani prison for many, many, many years, and it was publicly known, that he had worked with the intelligence services. He was coming home as a hero. India and Pakistan negotiated, so it wasn't like one was outing any secrets here. He was publicly someone who they said had served in jail in Pakistan, for his country, etc. So he was coming home. And of course, we were desperate. I mean, what an exciting story. Like, it's the spy who comes home. You want to talk to him. You want to interview him. But of course, officialdom would have none of it. So first at the airport, the most important thing in journalism is actually never to know the big guy, but always to know the small guy. By small, I mean, in quotes, who's the person at the door? Who's the driver? Who's the, you've got to know these people. It doesn't matter if you know the minister and the CEO. If you want to get access, you actually have to know the people down the hierarchy who are actually the hands. So we had kind of befriended the driver of this ambassador car, and we were like, can you tell us which gate? Because in the airport in Delhi has multiple gates, and if people have to be, can be got out from a secret gate. So they tried to do that. They kept changing the gate. Anyway, finally he came out. We were not allowed to we were not allowed to speak to him, and I was adamant that I had to get this interview, so I decided that the only way this ambassador with him in it will stop is if I climb onto this ambassador. So I jumped onto the ambassador, and I sat on the roof of it, and for a while the driver kept moving with me sitting on top of it. Then some bureaucrat got out and asked me to come down, and I was allowed 5 minutes to talk to him, and you could do these things then because, there was just a certain level of manic energy, basically.
Well, that's wonderful. But speaking of this kind of warrior class, I mean, I take that word lightly because you were in Kargil, 99. When I say you were in Kargil when the hill was being reclaimed, and you were among the forces over there, right? But I have a question, all those stories already told. You're a woman, aggressive, journalist. Everything is new about this whole thing. How did you land the gig? No competition? Nobody who said from your company he would rather do it?
I was the first to pitch for it, and I was told that I can't go because I'm a woman. There's a historic sort of influence here. My mother was India's first woman to cover a war. Her name was Barkha Dutt, and she died when I was 13 years old. But in 1965, she worked at the Hindustan Times. There was no television then. And when she wanted to go and cover the war, she was told by her editor that we cannot send a woman to the war front. So she said, if you're not going to let me cover the biggest story that there is, then allow me to take a few days off. She had a cousin in the military. There were no cameras, etc. then. So she went with a notepad and pen in a sari, that too, to actually report from the war front. I mentioned this because I had been molded to never take no for an answer. And although she died when I was very young, I think that sort of influence remained with me. So I pleaded, I fought, I argued, I begged. And the one thing the military told me was that we can't give you special treatment. So I said, what do you mean by special treatment? I understand there's a war. So they said, look, we can't give you a separate place to stay. We can't guarantee food, and we can't provide a bathroom, right? And I don't understand how, as a woman, you are going to tackle all of these things. I said, leave it to me. If the guys go, behind a tree, behind a rock, in the field, I will do the same. And I do not want any special treatment. It was not easy to get the go-ahead to go. But once I was there, I was also very defensive that anything I might do, if I got too emotional, any misstep, we were young 20-somethings reporting this war. I was very conscious all the time about being female at the front line who'd had to fight for this assignment. And sure enough, two things happened after this, right? I became the face of the Kargil war. The army chief called me in and he said, thank you for everything that you did and so on. But I found that there was a section, there were many people that loved me, much more that loved, but there was a section that resented so much that a woman could get this kind of profile and attention that I became actually the butt of the worst sort of malicious slander, online, sort of, oh, you gave away positions. These were the kind of things that were said to me. And I was so hurt that I actually went and asked the army chief. I said, sir, did I do something without realizing it? And he said, absolutely not. Please, we have called you here to thank you for what you did because you really changed the perception of how this war was perceived. But till this date, some internet troll will write this to me. Somebody will, and I have learned as I grow older. I remember I was interviewing Hillary Clinton once and she said, if you're a woman who's successful and opinionated and independent, also grow a skin as thick as the hide of a rhinoceros. So it's a work in progress, but...
You are the poster girl of controversy,
I am the poster girl of controversy because people do not like a successful, independent woman.
Right, I believe that.
If I were a man, no one would ever say this to me.
That was my question. Male journalists don't have that, do they?
Not at all.
Even when you were accused of reporting things for the Taj terrorist attack over there, wrongful reporting was attributed to you when you weren't even there in Bombay at the time.
So, it's so intriguing that if you do something well, nobody wants to give you the credit for it. But if something goes, let's say if the media falls short, in any way, there can be a debate. In 2611, for instance, today we are told that there were handlers in Pakistan who were watching everything that the TV channels were doing. There were a few hundred, probably more, maybe 500 journalists reporting this story. Among many other people, the first couple of days of the siege, the 3-day siege, we were live because we didn't know they were handlers. We were doing the best we could. There was no communication from authorities, no communication from government. And later, the most strange things were said to me, oh, you were in touch with the Pakistanis. You were giving away detail. I mean, bizarre. It used to hurt when I was younger. Now I find it so ludicrous. I recognize the pattern in it. I do not engage with it. But I will say this, it is deeply misogynistic. There's not a single man who is held to account in the same way. And I don't mind being held to account. No question scares me. Ask me anything, I'll answer it. I know my flaws. I know my virtues. I know what I've done, but this was strange. I mean, there was a blog attributing reporting to me. I lived in Delhi. I wasn't even in Bombay on the first day. Just to give you a sense of what you go through when you're in the public eye. And I always find that even this word controversial, it won't be used for Ornab, Rajdeep, etc., right? It prefixes itself to the women.
Speaking of them, there's a certain shrillness that is happening in studios.
Yes.
And while it's one thing to say that some of the public, they like in-your-face kind of stuff, and some others don't like it. There is the matter of trust.
Yeah.
Now, it's a matter of inspiring. News is supposed to inspire trust. The industry should inspire trust. Now, how can we expect the public to trust a journalist or an anchor, a shrill journalist or an anchor, any more than they will trust a shrill doctor?
Look, I don't like what's happened to television at all. I left it for that reason. I still believe in visual storytelling, and therefore Mojo Story, which is my digital platform, is video first. Most digital outlets start with a website and they then add video. We took the very, very risky but clear decision of starting with video. We started with a YouTube channel, and it so happened we started this at the end of 2019, and COVID happened 3 months later, and this channel was built on the back of old-fashioned boots-on-the-ground reporting, classic journalism. We didn't reinvent the wheel. We did what journalists were meant to do, and has, in many cases, not all, stopped doing. So I don't like television, and I don't want to pass the buck to the audience and say, you're responsible for it, why do you watch it? But I do want to say that, do remember that everything you watch, you're an eyeball. So when you tell television journalists or anchors that, you guys are chasing TRPs, you have to remember that the TRP is television rating point. It is all of you in part. So if you don't like something, don't give it legitimacy, because even if you watch it as entertainment, and this is the real tragedy, the demise of news is, or the reduction of news to theater and entertainment, even if you watch it, and I've heard a lot of people say, I've had a tough day, I'll just put that TV on mute, and I'll watch to see what the latest comic primetime craziness is. I get it, but the more of you who turn that on, that outlet gets to say to its advertisers, see, we have so many people. And the fact is that the revenue model of television is broken, which is why that kind of theatrical kind of rubbish, today, if it gets the endorsement of eyeballs and it gets the money of advertisers, it will be what will define the demise of TV.
It's true that that debate is not going to stop as long as we need advertising to support us.
Yeah.
Speaking of the shrillness that's gone everywhere, all over social media, Elon Musk every day tweets about how shrill things are becoming, even more, as proudly so, etc. All of this is going on right now. Speaking of reaction, have you stopped answering every single tweet?
Yes. That was the toughest lesson in life for me. People say as you grow older, what do you learn? You learn that trolling and people pretending to be critics are actually, for most part, I'm not saying I've never had a healthy conversation with a critic. That would be a generalization. I've had some. But 80%, or I would say even 90% of those who leave comments below your tweets are actually looking for a way to silence you, or for a way to get under your skin, for a way to make you alter what you say. A lot of people in my industry, unfortunately, younger people, because they can't deal with the virtual lynch mobs, have now started modifying their publicly stated views in an effort to seek approval, in an effort to seek the endorsement of whatever they think the dominant narrative is. When I was in my 20s and early 30s, I would literally answer anybody who said anything to me. At 50, I have finally stopped. I don't care. And it's kind of delicious, right? What really bothers them is you're not reacting. There is power. There is power in not engaging.
All of the foregoing was from that wonderful book, and I had a lovely time reading it, This Unquiet Land, Stories from India's Fault Lines. It has everything in it. You're something of a Forrest Gump figure. You've been in every single disaster that's occurred since there was television, right?
Yes.
Now, dizzying as that narrative was, your latest book, Humans of COVID, is highly sensitive. It deals with it in a completely different way, and there's tales from all over the country. Each one's tragedy is unique. But I want to get to the heart of it. Underlying all of the stories of tragedy was the similarity, and that was they all faced an enemy other than COVID, the pandemic. It was apathy, right? And I'd like to, before you answer, I'd like to quote from your book. It says, if 2020 held a mirror to our social inequities, 2021 broke the compact between citizen and state. What did you find?
I think I found, I remember when my father died, and my sister and I were orphans because our mother had died when I was 13 and she was 9. And when my father died, I said, yeah, we're orphans. And I mean, that even as I say it today, I can't really process the enormity of that. But I said, my job right now is to report the stories of the orphans of the state. There are people who have been orphaned by the state. I mean it metaphorically, not literally. And what I meant by that is when you needed less of the state. For example, when workers were walking home and were being beaten by a police force that had been weaponized to stop them, and that was too much of the state. But when you needed the state, when you needed someone to tell you where to get oxygen from, when you needed someone to tell you how to get a hospital bed, when I would meet, I literally saw people dying on the street in ambulances outside the closed gates of hospitals, and I would start messaging whichever chief minister in whichever state I was in, trying to say, please, can you at least put up like a counter here? Can you have an officer here? Somebody to tell people where they should go, I remember meeting a woman who had just given birth to a one-day-old child, and she had COVID, and she had to hand over her one-day-old child to somebody, and she had COVID, she didn't know what to do. She was sitting at the back of an auto rickshaw. I saw 2 little kids watch their mother die in an ambulance because there was no bed. And so for me, I think I just felt like people, of course, I have to caveat it by saying that it was a really difficult time. The world struggled. Look at China today. I mean, I think it should end the sort of sections of upper middle class Indians who like to say India should be more like China. It's a disaster. There are protests on the street in an authoritarian regime like China because their COVID handling has been so horrible. So I will caveat it by saying countries across the world struggled. But I do know that people had to turn really to each other. Gurdwaras that had, I don't know how many of you saw this, but one of the most disturbing and at the same time uplifting stories that I reported on was the phenomena of Gurdwara langars. Now, a langar, as you know, is a Gurdwara laying out food for the poor. The Gurdwaras I was traveling to were laying out oxygen cylinders. And so you had these big giant cylinders, on the road, and literally it was like a drive-through. And everybody from the poor rickshawala to the lady in the Mercedes, neither of whom could get oxygen, would drive through, would be allowed to use that oxygen cylinder for 20 minutes, breathe to live another day, and then move on. So I think my thing was when we needed the state, we needed the benevolence of the state. We didn't have the benevolence of the state. Maybe the state didn't know what to do. At every wave, next wave, we learned from our mistakes, right? And of course, there are countries that did much worse than us. And all of that is acknowledged. It was a difficult time. Everybody was, it was hit and miss. But I know that there was a kind of essential loneliness to being in that moment. And at the same time, not all was lost. Because while my book is about sadness and sorrow, it's also about hope. I chronicled so many stories of people across communities, across religions, unlike what your TV channels were trying to do, which was to divide people, actually coming together to help people, strangers. My own journey. Everything was closed in the first wave. I survived because people, strangers, gave me places to stay, gave me food to eat, even offered, I had 4 pairs of clothes and I was gone. And I didn't come back home till 125 days later. And I was given, I remember a woman messaging me and saying, you're going to think I'm crazy, but can I do your laundry? And I actually would go and leave like a bag of clothes outside her house. And the 3 days I was in Bombay, she would launder them for me and put them back, and I would then wear the same shirt again. My shoes broke. Somebody got a shoe shop open and gave me shoes. In Bangalore, I mean, people sent food, people I didn't know. So we have to also remember that in this moment of loneliness was community. A sense of community that I think we had maybe lost, or maybe our channels and the toxicity of our social media made us believe that, oh, everything is broken. No, everything is not broken. People are still people. People are still human. People still care for each other. I think we must walk away from these bleak years with some sense of hope.
And the executive apathy that you spoke of also visited the country when they were trying to get those 2 companies in India to Serum Institute and Bharat to make the vaccine. I explained this to me. I haven't been able to understand it. Endless negotiations on price. Let me put myself out here. Something tells me that if we had Indira Gandhi at the helm of things, she would have just nationalized them and made the vaccines.
But the fault was not because they were private. I think that is a misreading of it. My understanding of it is between the first wave and the second wave, there was a mistaken assumption that there was an Indian exceptionalism, that we'd either been given the BCG or we were just hardy people because, we're just tougher than the West. Because the first wave had not been as devastating in scale and fatality, so there was an assumption that the second wave we can handle. So we actually started sending our vaccines to neighboring countries, and I was among those who was like, wow, that's such a moment of pride to see our Air Force jets leaving with these boxes of vaccines. I also, felt that. The biggest mistake we made was that, when I say we, I mean the state in this case, not enough vaccines were ordered. Were bought. In the middle of January of 2022, when the vaccine rollout was to begin, the vaccines, I don't remember the exact figure, but I remember computing it and finding that the vaccines weren't enough to inoculate even half of the adult population of Delhi, of one city-state. And so basically, that mistaken calculation that the second wave would pass in the same way as the first wave without too much damage led to not purchasing or placing orders for enough vaccines. Once we had the vaccines, because we have a history of mass immunization, our vaccine rollout was quite smooth compared to the rest of the world. But we just didn't have the vaccines. And we didn't have the vaccines because there was a miscalculation about how lethal the second wave would be, so we didn't order enough.
So is this criticism valid only in hindsight?
No, I do believe that, that the government should have, because even if those vaccines had been in surplus, let's say the worst case scenario was that the vaccines were in surplus, they should have been purchased. They
Yes.
should have been purchased. And
Other countries did.
And other countries did. The other countries have other things on their conscience, like the Americans who stacked up these vaccines and didn't mandate them, and then those vaccines went waste because they wouldn't mandate the vaccines, which is amoral given the inequity in the world. But we should have ordered those vaccines. 100% we should have ordered those vaccines.
I could talk to you all day. The big red signs come out.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And the book is wonderful. I mean, this is just a small taste of all the wonderful stuff that you can find in a book. Barkha Dutt.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.